To continue this little series of what's memorably been described in one comment as button accountancy, quite a fan of that, it's time we look at the Prussian Reserve. Much like the similar video I recorded on facings and sword knots, my aim is to give a detailed overview of some of the history plus various aspects of uniform and equipment for these troops. This will act as a series of extended footnotes, if you like, for the accompanying painting guides to follow imminently. Anyway, timestamps are below should you want to skip ahead to the uniform stuff, but I recommend listening to the history to understand why they're quite so odd. Reservists were hugely important, both numerically and symbolically, within the Befreiungskriege, or Wars of Liberation. The Prussian army of 1813 contained large numbers of such civilian reservists, who, in combination with the Landwehr, who were militia, as well as volunteers in various Freikorps and groups of Jäger, in fact outnumbered the regular line infantry. Indeed, the conflict has long been characterised in German-speaking Europe as something of a people's war against Napoleon's occupation and wars of aggression across Europe. One important factor in the size of Prussia's reserve at this time was, of course, Scharnhorst's famous Krümper system, about which much has been written and said in Napoleonic discourse. Briefly, for those unfamiliar, it involved the systematic furloughing of trained men while taking on an equal number of new recruits in their place. The rate eventually settled on in the Cabinet Order of August 1808 was 5 per month from each company, cycling out the oldest men to be replaced by 18-year-olds. This system is often presented as an ingenious method by which to circumvent a particularly bothersome article of the treaty between France and Prussia on the 8th of September 1808, which limited the total size of the Prussian military to 42,000 men, for a duration of 10 years. This was to be divided between 10 regiments of infantry, totalling no more than 22,000, 8 regiments of cavalry of 32 squadrons for another 8,000, a corps of artillerymen, miners and sappers of 6,000, and the Guard of the King for the remaining 6,000. To be sure, Scharnhorst's plan did have the effect of building up a trained reserve in excess of that 42,000 figure that Prussia was allowed, but, as Peter Hoschler points out in his book on the Prussian Reserve, Scharnhorst's proposal came in July 1807, more than a year before the treaty limiting the size of the army. The practice itself of furloughing Prussian troops in this way can be traced back to before even the 7 Years' War. Its roots lie in the canton system, by which regiments were organised under Frederick the Great, who similarly operated a system of cycling out trained soldiers for new recruits, in order to reduce the financial burden on the Prussian economy of maintaining what was, proportionally, such a big army for its population. The whole situation brings to mind Voltaire's well-known adage that, where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Anyway, coming back to the period in question. Each infantry regiment was ordered to form an ersatz, or depot company, in November 1807. The idea was that in wartime those individual companies would grow in size to become entire battalions through the addition of the previously furloughed reservists, by now known as the Krümper, plus further men from the battalion's Stammregiment, often translated in this context as parent regiment. We see an early version of this plan in the formation of what were deceptively titled Training Depot Battalions in June 1811. Now, the rate of 5 men a month might not sound that much, but replicated across each company from each battalion of each regiment every month over a period of several years, quite the number of reservists had been accumulated by this point. Indeed, by mid-1811, just over 25,000 such men were deemed to be fit for active service, and by the end of the year it was over 31,000. Remember, all these furloughed men were in addition to the permitted 22,000 professional soldiers who hadn't been furloughed. All this means that when it did come time to mobilise those trained reservists, there were plenty to call on. Those already in those training depot battalions were simply renamed as 3rd Musketeer Battalions, one for each regiment of the line. Other reservists were called up to bring the various line regiments themselves up to field strength, and still more were gradually mobilised as new Reserve Musketeer Battalions, again still attached to the main infantry regiments of the line. The whole process naturally took a number of months, some of it, as in the case of von Bülow's shenanigans around Königsberg in December 1812, right under the nose of an increasingly suspicious Marshal Murat. Many of the resulting, almost ad hoc formations contained a mix of reservists, new recruits, and men drawn from line battalions. These were assembled by the likes of von Bülow, von Borstel, and York, and they appear in the orders of battle for Lutzen and Bautzen during the spring campaign of 1813. At Lutzen, in the Lower Silesian Brigade, we see the 3rd Musketeer Battalion of the 1st and 2nd West Prussian Infantry Regiments, for instance. Afterwards, at Bautzen, the same brigade is further bolstered by the addition of the 2nd and 3rd Reserve Battalions of the Leipzig Infantry Regiment. During the armistice, there then occurs a rather convoluted process of reorganisation, even by Prussian standards. I'd mentioned previously in my video on Prussian unit facings, linked in the corner of the screen, how the foot guards were removed from the line, freeing up the spot of the 8th Infantry Regiment, leading to the renumbering of the regiments above them and the creation of a new Brandenburg Regiment, or arguably a second Brandenburg Regiment, but I'm not getting into that again. This curiously titled Brandenburg Regiment was in fact cobbled together from several of those battalions of reservists just mentioned. It featured the first 2 reserve battalions of the Leipzig Regiment and the 3rd Musketeer Battalion of the 1st West Prussians. Most of the other 3rd Musketeer and Reserve Battalions were then reorganised into their own dedicated reserve infantry regiments. 12 of them in total, most made up of 3 battalions, but in a handful of cases including a 4th as well, which in time was typically broken up to fill the ranks of the remaining 3. Note, by the way, that whereas the line regiments all had a Fusilier or light battalion, plus 2 musketeer battalions, no such designation existed for the reserve infantry regiments. In the case of reserve regiments 1, 2 and 3, it was a former reserve Fusilier battalion that went on to form its 3rd battalion, but they never kept the title. It would take too long to read through the exact origins of every single battalion in each regiment, but on screen now are a series of tables that you can pause if you'd like to review a particular one of interest. The images, by the way, are drawn from a pamphlet by Robert Mantle, published by the Napoleonic Association in the late 1970s, and reproduced on the Napoleon series website, the link to which I've put in the video description. In the case of those reserve battalions which don't reappear in one of these regiments, such as the 3rd and 4th Reserve Musketeer Battalions of the 1st West Prussians, or the 3rd Reserve Musketeer Battalion of the 2nd West Prussians, they were disbanded during the armistice. As you'd expect, given the nature of the furlough system through which the bulk of these regiments were assembled, as well as their concealed nature as training depot battalions in some cases, plus the disproportionate size of the Prussian army versus the scale of its economy, there is very little uniformity to what these men wore. The cadre of officers, NCOs and musicians in a reserve infantry battalion wore the regular uniform of the Stamm regiment from which they had been drawn. I already have a full painting guide for those regular uniforms, linked in the corner of the screen now. As for which regiment's uniform to use for the reserve battalions, well, pre-armistice it's easy enough to work out, since the newly formed 3rd Musketeer and Reserve Infantry Battalions was still part of their parent regiment at the time. For post-armistice, I've added a table on screen to go through each one in order. As you'll see, there are a few cases where the reserve infantry regiments are drawn from a number of different parent regiments, leading to some variety in the uniforms worn by the cadre of different battalions. Lots of my sources were a bit inconsistent here. Some would switch between the pre- and post-armistice numberings for the Stamm regiments, seemingly at random. Others mixed up the cadre for different battalions within a regiment so that officers with Silesian facings were leading men from West Prussian regiments, and so on. As always, I've cross-referenced between several sources in an attempt to weed out any of these inconsistencies, but with these units, inconsistency is kind of in their nature. Anyway, look up the facing colours for the parent regiment in the painting guide I linked earlier, and away you go. Next, onto the reservists themselves. The so-called regulation reservist uniform was set out in a cabinet order of the 20th of December 1812. This was issued to all battalions of reservists at the beginning of hostilities. Instead of resembling the regular uniform of the line infantry regiments, with their double-breasted collet, tails and Brandenburg cuffs, it was instead based on their fatigue dress. This consisted of a grey single-breasted jacket with either brass or cloth-covered buttons, 8 of them for the counters amongst us. No cuffs or tails were present, for the most part, and only some wore a collar and shoulder patches, sometimes grey, sometimes the facing colour of the parent regiment. Trousers were grey as well, with black gaiters, but some wore breeches. The men were all issued with a grey Schirmmütze, or peaked cap, but many tried to swap these for a shako when possible, even resorting to straw ones in a couple of cases. Most were issued with a simple canvas backpack as well, instead of the calfskin ones worn by the line regiments. You'll notice a lot of variability then, and this was just how things stood at the beginning of the campaign. Rather than getting too caught up on every version of this for the sake of 2 battles, Lutzen and Bautzen, I figured that most watching these videos would be more interested in how things stood post-armistice, when the reserve infantry had been organised into their individual regiments. So, here goes. I've grouped these into 5 broad categories of uniform. The first category covers various versions of the grey regulation uniform just described. These were retained by the following reserve infantry regiments: numbers 6, 7, 10, 11, and 12. Among the more notable alterations to these uniforms by individual battalions were the 1st Battalion of the 6th Regiment, who added short tails to their jacket; the 3rd Battalion of the 6th, who wore theirs in dark blue; the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 7th, who added crimson piping to the leading edge, collar, cuffs, and shoulder straps; the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 10th, who by 1814 had mostly dyed theirs in dark blue; and the 3rd Battalion of the 10th, who wore theirs in black. For 28mm figures, plastic sculpts wearing this uniform are available from Wargames Atlantic. There's a variety of different packs and greatcoat rolls across the sculpts, with some in trousers and others wearing breeches and gaiters. There's also a choice of heads, wearing both the Schirmütze and Shako. Metal versions are also available from the Perries. That's codes PN 53 to 56, which cover both caps and shakos either with trousers or breeches and gaiters. And from Calpe, codes PR 15 to 28, plus 59 to 64, again with a choice of headwear, packs and different poses. The second category features a type of dark blue Portuguese uniform, supplied by the British, with tails square cut into the body of the jacket, and lace on the buttons, although this was habitually removed by the soldiers, who seemed not to have liked the rather un-Prussian appearance it gave them. All manner of other alterations seem to have taken place, such as adding a second row of buttons to make them more Prussian. The men were also issued with a tall stovepipe shako, with a red and white plume, again sometimes swapped for a Prussian one when available. Uniforms of this style were worn by the following reserve infantry regiments: the 1st Battalion of the 1st Regiment, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 2nd Regiment, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 4th Regiment, and the 2nd Battalions of the 5th, 8th and 9th Regiments. These uniforms are featured on metal sculpts by the Perries, code PN 38, and Calpe, codes PR 39 to 48. The third category is, like the second, based on a dark blue Portuguese-style uniform, but with fairly distinctive shoulder rolls, tails that were rounded into the body of the jacket, and some differences in lace. These were worn by the 1st Battalions of the 8th and 9th Reserve Infantry Regiments. Somewhat surprisingly, given how niche these are, we have again a choice of metal sculpts, between the Perries, codes PN 37, and Calpe, codes PR 29 to 38. Category 4 was another British supplied uniform, but this time in dark green, closely based on that worn by British riflemen. This was a single-breasted jacket with short tails, worn, once again, with a stovepipe shako. These were issued to the 3rd Battalion of the 8th and 9th Reserve Infantry Regiments. Only Calpe has a dedicated sculpt for these, with the correct muskets, equipment, and so on. Codes PR 49 to 58. The 5th category covers those regiments which wore the regular uniform of the Prussian line infantry regiments, just like their cadre of officers. These were the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Battalions of the 1st Reserve Infantry Regiment, the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, all battalions of the 3rd Regiment, and the 1st Battalion of the 5th. In at least some cases, these were, I understand, received gradually by the regiments, so a mix between these plus others in the regulation grey uniform across a battalion would probably be most fitting. As the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed, there are then some oddballs who fit under none of these categories. We have the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Reserve Infantry Regiment, who wore the first version of the Portuguese uniform that I mentioned, that's the one without shoulder rolls, but in green, and last but certainly not least, the 1st Battalion of the 4th Reserve Infantry Regiment, who, rather oddly, were a modified version of the blue French habit vest. This was the result of an incident in April 1813, when, after capturing Halle, or Halle/Saale as it's now officially known, the battalion in question equipped themselves from French clothing stores. All of this, you must of course remember, was only how the uniforms were issued, never mind what they would have looked like after a few months of battles. So, there we have it. A glimpse into the sheer madness that is Prussian Reserve infantry uniforms. Not all grey, is it? The sources I used in putting this together were Stephen Summerfield's book, Prussian Infantry 1808 to 1840, Volume 2, Jaeger, Reserve, Freikorps and New Regiments, 1813 to 1840. Peter Hofschurer's entry to the Osprey Men-at-Arms series, Prussian Reserve, Militia and Irregular Troops, 1806 to 15. Robert Mantle's pamphlet, Prussian Reserve Infantry 1813-15, published by the Napoleonic Association, and the uniform plates of Richard and Herbert Knirtel. If you're planning to paint up a particular regiment of any of these, and want to dig even further into the topic, then I do recommend picking up one of the sources mentioned, just to get your head around any further quirks to the uniforms, like the colour of the greatcoats a certain battalion might have carried. As I said earlier, you may find a few inconsistencies between one source and the next. That's why I always end up cross-referencing between at least 3 or 4 when putting these videos together. Anyway, you can probably see why this warranted a video of its own prior to picking up the paintbrush. If you're interested in watching a guide when it's uploaded, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. Videos like this are far from quick to put together, so your support is much appreciated. And with that, all that's left to say is good luck with your hobbying, and until next time.